The original script's central idea is that the announced US-Iran ceasefire is likely political theater rather than real peace. Its key arguments are that military movements, proxy violence, and decentralized war structures make a durable settlement extremely unlikely. Its major turning points include the ceasefire announcement, the continued force buildup, the strikes in Lebanon, and the broader discussion of imperial decline and global disorder. And its hidden implications are that long wars outgrow the politicians who claim to control them. That economic shock could reshape the world faster than diplomacy can, and that in a more unstable future, community may matter more than ideology or wealth. With that in mind, here is the fully rewritten script in a new style. What if the most dangerous moment in a war is not when the bombs fall, but when leaders suddenly start talking about peace? That is the question hanging over this ceasefire, because on the surface, it sounds like a breakthrough, a pause, a chance to step back from the edge, but underneath it all, the signs point in the opposite direction. When a country says it wants peace while still moving troops, still shifting weapons, still positioning ships and aircraft, you have to ask a very simple question. Is this really diplomacy, or is it preparation? In this view, the answer is grim. The ceasefire looks less like a final settlement and more like a pause in the script, a moment to reorganize, to test reactions, to buy time, and perhaps to set the stage for something even bigger. The deeper problem is that wars like this do not end just because leaders shake hands in a neutral city and read from a document. Once a conflict reaches a certain level, it develops its own momentum. Armies build habits, commanders form expectations, factions harden, and people on the battlefield stop trusting words coming from distant capitals. That is why any so-called peace deal here appears fragile from the beginning. If one side still believes the other is preparing an attack, then every silence feels like deception, every delay feels like a trap, and every agreement starts to look like camouflage. And then there is the structure of the war itself. If a military system is dispersed, flexible, and spread across local cells that can act with relative autonomy, then a political deal at the top does not automatically stop the fighting below. In fact, it may do the opposite. It may expose a gap between the leadership that wants a pause and the fighters who believe surrender is hidden inside the language of diplomacy. That is when a ceasefire becomes dangerous, because instead of freezing the conflict, it reveals how little central authority remains. In that kind of environment, peace is not just difficult to negotiate, it is difficult to enforce. And that means a deal can collapse not because the paper was weak, but because the war has already escaped the control of those pretending to manage it. The contradictions only deepen when proxy groups enter the picture. If one side believes its allied forces are covered by the agreement while the other side believes they are excluded, then the ceasefire contains a built-in detonator. A strike on Lebanon, a retaliation in Yemen, a misunderstanding dressed up as ambiguity, and suddenly the entire framework starts to crack. Then comes the oldest move in geopolitics. Each side blames the other for violating a peace no one fully defined in the first place. That is why this moment feels less like the end of hostilities and more like the beginning of a more confusing phase where public statements promise calm while real events move toward escalation. Behind all of this is a harsher argument about how power actually works. The world, in this interpretation, is not driven primarily by public slogans or official explanations, but by stories powerful people believe about history, destiny, order, and decline. First come the ideas, then the networks built around those ideas, and then the political actors who carry them into the real world. The names change, the parties change, the flags change, but the pattern remains the same. Some people imagine the future, some finance it, some enforce it. And most ordinary people live inside systems they never chose. That is why the script treats geopolitics not as a random collection of crises, but as a struggle over the shape of the next world order. From that perspective, the US is still immensely powerful, but it is no longer able to sustain the illusion of total control forever. It may lose influence in one region while still dominating trade routes, financial systems, and military choke points somewhere else. Decline, in other words, does not mean weakness overnight. It means a shift in what can be held, what must be abandoned, and who gets sacrificed in the transition. That is where the global economy enters the story. A long war in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. It moves through energy prices, shipping lanes, food costs, insurance markets, industrial supply chains, and political stability. It reaches people who have never heard a missile siren but suddenly cannot afford fuel, transport, or basic goods. And once that pressure spreads, alliances begin to strain. Even countries that publicly support resistance or condemn aggression start calculating the cost of chaos. Friends become cautious, neutral states become anxious, and major powers begin pushing for de-escalation, not out of principle, but out of fear that the system itself cannot absorb the shock. This is why the original script treats China and other so-called alternative centers of power with such suspicion. In this view, they are not fully outside the global system, but deeply entangled in it, built up through trade, finance, industrial integration, and the promise of stability. That means they do not benefit from a full breakdown nearly as much as people imagine. If the arteries of global commerce seize up, they bleed too. So while many expect a clean rivalry between empires, the darker possibility is that the whole structure is more interconnected, more fragile, and more vulnerable to sudden stress than almost anyone wants to admit. Then comes another unsettling idea. Modern politics is often less coherent than it appears. Leaders are presented as masterminds or fools, but in reality they may be both symbols and instruments, improvising inside a machine that is bigger than them. Take unpredictability. It can look like chaos, ignorance, or ego, yet politically it can be useful. An erratic leader paralyzes opponents, floods the public with distraction, and preserves room to reverse direction without ever admitting failure. One day, the message is war. The next day, negotiation, then threat, then calm, then outrage, then triumph. The confusion is not always a bug. Sometimes it is the strategy. It keeps enemies uncertain, supporters emotionally engaged, and institutions off balance. But even that kind of tactical flexibility has a limit, because eventually, every political performance collides with material reality. Weapons need supply lines. Armies need willing soldiers. Economies need energy. And societies need a reason to keep paying the cost. That is where the script's darker predictions begin to gather force. If the war continues, the global economy weakens. If the economy weakens, public anger rises. If public anger rises, governments lose room to maneuver. If governments lose room to maneuver, internal fractures widen. And those fractures may appear not only in Iran or Israel or the United States, but across the entire system that tied security, trade, and political legitimacy together for decades. The result is a world that does not become neatly unipolar or neatly multipolar, but unstable, improvised, and harsh. Regional powers compete. Temporary alignments form. Old assumptions die. And nobody can be certain how long the next order will last before it too begins to crack. The script also makes a sharp distinction between technology and human will. It argues that people in comfortable societies have become too enchanted by machines, too convinced that precision weapons, surveillance systems, drones, and advanced platforms can replace sacrifice, cohesion, and conviction. But technology, no matter how advanced, still depends on people who maintain it, deploy it, believe in it, and are willing to bear the cost of failure. A society that thinks tools can substitute for morale may discover too late that machines are efficient but not creative, powerful but not alive. Human beings adapt. They improvise. They endure. They find ways around systems that looked invincible on paper. And if one side is willing to fight through pain while the other side wants clean victory at low cost, then the side with greater comfort may end up with greater vulnerability. That is why the script insists that no amount of money or hardware can fully compensate for a loss of purpose. In the end, wars are not sustained by technology alone. They are sustained by people who believe something is worth enduring for. From there, the script turns inward, away from states and armies and toward individual survival. And this may be its most emotionally powerful move. Because after all the talk of empires, currencies, proxies, and military strategy, the final message is that individuals will not navigate a chaotic era through isolation. They will not outsmart collapse with personal wealth alone, nor protect themselves forever through cleverness, status, or private ambition. The only real shelter in this vision is human connection, family, community, shared purpose, moral seriousness. A reason to wake up that is bigger than consumption, vanity, or professional success. The coming age, if this argument is right, will punish people who mistake comfort for security and reward those who learn how to belong, how to build trust, and how to carry meaning through disorder. Even the spiritual turn in the script comes from that same logic. When systems fail, people look for more than explanation. They look for orientation. They want a story that tells them where they are, why suffering exists, and what kind of person they must become to endure it. Not everyone will change. Many will cling to the old world until it is gone. But those who adapt may not be the richest or most connected. They may simply be the ones who accept that history has entered a more dangerous chapter and decide to live with courage instead of denial. And that may be the most unsettling conclusion of all. The real threat is not just war in one region or collapse in one market. It is the slow realization that the systems people trusted to organize the modern world may be weaker, more theatrical, and more temporary than they seemed. A ceasefire may be announced. Negotiations may begin. Officials may smile for cameras. But if the underlying forces remain unresolved, then peace is only a pause between shocks. And when the next shock comes, the people who survive it may not be those who predicted every twist correctly, but those who understood one simple truth before everyone else. In an age of unraveling power, borrowed stability disappears fast, and what remains is character, loyalty, and the communities willing to face the dark together.